Good afternoon, whenever you're watching this. Today we have a lesson entitled How Did the Truman Doctrine Impact Foreign Policy in the 1950s and 1960s? So I had asked you to just do a little review of the Truman Doctrine, and so let's identify some of the key ideas. It's the first application of the policy of containment, and that was an idea put forth by George Kennan. And it was the first time the United States strayed from George Washington's farewell address to maintain peacetime isolation. And Truman established $400 million in military and economic aid to Greece and Turkey, with the thinking that it must be the U.S. policy to support free people who are resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. Okay, so today we're going to be evaluating the wisdom of this significant change in U.S. foreign policy. So we have a couple of developments here. First of all, we have George Kennan's analysis of the Soviet behavior that we read the other day in the long telegram. And he established that there will be two poles. And what this means is that the United States and the Soviet Union would be opposite poles, and that other nations around the world would kind of revolve around these two superpowers. And the Soviet Union is going to be aggressive in its push to expand communism, and the best course of action for the United States would be a military buildup. That's a choice that was made. We could have extended diplomacy, but that's not the choice that was made. Okay, so after World War II, there was a reluctance by the Soviets to leave Iran. They wanted a buffer zone in northern Iran and to gain permanent access to the Persian Gulf. So the United States left January 1st, 1946. The British planned to leave in March, but the Soviets refused and vowed to support a separatist movement to establish a Kurdish state. So the United States wound up loaning money to Iran, and Iran ended its relationship to the Soviet Union. So just some background between the United States and Iran that was going to come up again later. Looking at our next development, that there was difficulty in implementing the Potsdam Agreement. And this is the idea whether or not the free elections are going to be held in Poland. The Soviet Union was preventing this from happening, and the United States had no answer. Simply, what are we going to do to stop their aggression? It was a big question mark. Then we have the inability to reach an accord to control atomic energy. Bernard Baruch, an American, he proposed an international atomic development authority with a monopoly on nuclear power, but the Soviets rejected that, and they proposed instead a ban on all nuclear weapons, which the United States rejected. So in the end, there was no agreement, and it led to an arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Iron Curtain speech given by Winston Churchill defined the problem as us against them. Again, it did not have to be defined this way, but that's the way it worked during the Cold War. In 1946, we see both houses of Congress achieving Republican majority. So they push forth their Republican ideas, the tax cuts that we had talked about in the 1920s, and they push for the idea of containment. They passed a law called the Taft-Hartley Act, which isn't really Cold War related, but it's an important law that you should know about. So I'll just put it in here, that it limited unions with the idea of a right to work, that unions interfere with individuals' rights to bargain, but in reality it winds up hurting workers because unions help workers. So if the state and the federal government limit union rights, it winds up hurting workers. Also during this time, Congress passed a law that you should know called the National Security Act of 1947, which established the U.S. Air Force, the Department of Defense, that was the Department of War, but they changed it. They created the National Security Council, the Central Intelligence Agency. And so all of these things show that more and more government resources are going to be devoted to the military and anti-communist ideology. Then we have the situation in Greece and Turkey, which led to the Truman Doctrine. In the background, was that the U.S. was monitoring Greece's crumbling political and economic conditions, along with the rise of a communist group inside Greece called the National Liberation Front. And Turkey and Greece were facing Soviet pressure to share control of the Dardanelles Straits. And our response was to help Greece and Turkey fight off this pressure, which was successful. So some of the assumptions of the Truman administration were that it was urgent that communism be stopped, and that Greece and Turkey were on the verge of communist takeovers, the Soviet Union was aggressive, and that the United States must stop the Soviet Union. And the best way to accomplish these goals was to build up the U.S. military. Okay, so for our part B, we're going to explain how some of the logic from the Truman Doctrine shaped the following events. So I took out that middle column because I just wanted to go over the action taken. So we have a communist coup in Czechoslovakia. The Americans reacted forcefully, but didn't really do anything real. They just protested, and shortly thereafter they formed NATO. And this is a turning point in American history because it's our first peacetime alliance. And so that's something that you should note. We see the Soviet blockade of West Berlin, where America airlifted tons of food and medical supplies, and eventually the Soviets backed down. China fell to the communists in late 1949, and the State Department published a report called the White Paper, explaining why nothing could be done because American involvement in China was doomed to fail. So this is something, we were talking about communism as a threat. Well, they seem to be successful here, and we had no tools to fight it. North Korea's invasion across the 38th parallel in June of 1950. The U.S. intervened after the UN resolution was passed guaranteeing the sovereignty of South Korea. And that's something that we talked about the other day. Then in Iran, we have the nationalist prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, resisted Western corporate investments in Iran. So we have a lot of, when we talk about Western corporate investments, we're talking about oil companies owned by British and Americans. So we see the CIA and conservative Iranian military leaders staging a coup. So they replaced Mossadegh with the Shah Reza Pahlavi. He was a figurehead, but sympathetic to British and American oil companies. And I think I wanted to say something else about him, that he was also a dictator. So let's add that in. Who suppressed individual rights. So here we see the United States supporting this leader because he was interested in promoting oil companies' interest in his country. So this didn't bode well with some of the Iranian people because he was really not very kind and didn't respect individual rights. Okay, then we have a situation in the Suez Canal where President Nasser of Egypt became friendly with the Soviets, so the United States withdrew offers to help Egypt build the Aswan Dam. Nasser seized control of the Suez Canal from Great Britain in response to this, and Great Britain, France, and Israel attacked. The United States refused to help and supported a UN denunciation of their attack on Egypt. France, Great Britain, and Israel withdrew its forces, and a truce was signed. So this was a fight that the United States was not willing to get involved in, but in the end, the Suez Canal was opened. Okay, now we're going to move on to the Eisenhower administration, and they took a different approach. So let's start here, before we read this question, with Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. Okay, so he is a famous individual in history, even though he wasn't president, he was just the Secretary of State because he came up with this policy called massive retaliation. So Dulles saw containment as weak and passive. He was interested in a more active program to liberate and roll back communism. So his plan, called massive retaliation, was a policy which said that the U.S. should rely on the massive use of weapons, meaning nuclear weapons, instead of conventional fighting. This would give more bang for the buck and push the Soviets to the brink of war. So this is the idea of brinksmanship. They will then be nervous and make concessions. So a Truman supporter, in response to this question, would say that the policy of massive retaliation is just too risky. It isn't a good idea to gamble with nuclear weapons. And so the Eisenhower administration was faced with a couple of developments, like Fidel Castro's takeover of Cuba, ousting American-supported Fulgencio Batista in 1959. So the U.S. cut back the quota by which Cuba could export sugar to the United States at a favored price and severed diplomatic relations with Cuba. So this is why we had that embargo against Cuba for all those years. Unfortunately, then Cuba turned to the Soviet Union. Then there was a Hungarian Revolution in 1956. Hungary was part of the Warsaw Pact and was taken over by the Soviets. So Hungarian dissidents launched a popular uprising to demand economic reforms. The Soviet tanks came in and crushed the uprising. The Eisenhower administration refused to intervene. Next, we have the U-2 crisis, where the Soviets wanted the West to leave West Berlin, and there was going to be a meeting planned to discuss this situation. But days before the meeting, the Soviet Union announced that it shot down a U-2 spy plane and captured an American pilot named Gary Powers. So the meeting was called off. And that was not an ideal situation because maybe some things could have been worked out at this point. Okay, and then our final part of this discussion for today is Eisenhower's farewell address. And this is a really famous address, which you should know. It's his speech about the military-industrial complex. And of course, we know that it's possible, none of this is going to be on the AP exam, but just as part of your course in American history, you should absolutely know the speech. It's famous. Everybody knows what it is. Okay, so he gave this warning that the United States needs to watch out for the growth of the military. If the industries that are involved in wartime production become too big, they'll become central to our economy and job creation. This could lead politicians to make decisions about war and peace for reasons that have to do with sustaining our economy. And that's a dangerous place to be in. Okay, so Eisenhower goes on to draw a distinction between wartime and peacetime. He says we need to maintain the military buildup to prevent an attack, but at the same time, we must recognize the dangers of having a military-industrial complex as such an important part of the economy, our self-image, and our politics. So he's giving us this warning. And sadly, it seems to have come true, because when we look at the current war on terror, we're constantly engaged in this war on terror in much the same way as our war on communism. So we've got a military that's engaged in fighting terrorism around the world, and this entire national security apparatus of the federal government is engaged to prevent it. It's a similar danger, and it's certainly possible that politicians make decisions about war and peace based upon sustaining all of these industries that are committed to fighting terrorism. And that is certainly a danger. Okay, so let's go back to our aim for today. How did the Truman Doctrine impact foreign policy in the 1950s and 60s? Well, we see the United States getting involved in other places around the world. We see them lending money to Greece and Turkey. We see them making a decision based upon containment that the United States should get involved and prevent the spread of communism. And then we see they're willing to take actions in certain places and not in others. Getting involved in South Korea, protecting them is one thing, not getting involved in China. We kind of weighed our interests there, but we did stand up to protect American interests when we could. And that's a much more active role for the United States. And then we see the United States joining NATO, which is an absolute shift in our policy that had been consistent from the time George Washington was president. And so we get involved in a much more active way. And that takes us to the end of our discussion. Have a great day, everybody.